Hi, I'm Greg Columbus. My guest at this time is former Nebraska Attorney General Don Stenberg. He served in that capacity from 1991 to 2003 and became well known for leading the effort at the Supreme Court to outlaw partial birth abortions. Eventually, Congress passed legislation to ban them. President George W. Bush signed it, and the Supreme Court upheld it, finally, the second time around. As the abortion debate rages in America today, how much more polarized is America on this issue than it was a generation ago? We also want to get his reaction to the horrifying story of more than 2,000 fetal remains being kept at the home of a Midwestern abortion provider. And Mr. Stenberg, thank you very much for being with us.
Happy to be here. Thank you.
Well, let's start with that last story I mentioned. Just this week, we saw the burial of more than 2,400 fetal remains discovered at the home of an abortion provider who worked in Indiana and lived in Illinois. I'm sure you're horrified by the story, but what's your reaction to it, as well as the little amount of media attention such a story received?
Well, my first reaction was one of disgust and revulsion. I just don't understand how anybody could do such a depraved thing. And my second reaction was this demonstrates the need for greater oversight and regulation of abortion doctors. And the comment about your comment about very little media coverage is not surprising. It's disappointing, but not surprising. You may remember Dr. Gosnell, who was eventually convicted of murder for killing several newborn children. That got almost no coverage either. And the March for Life in Washington, again, among the mainstream media, gets minimal coverage despite the very, very large numbers that turn out year after year.
Sir, the abortion provider worked in South Bend, Indiana, and when he died and the remains were discovered, Mayor Pete Buttigieg had very little to say other than that the news should not be politicized. What's your reaction to that kind of terse reaction, especially when Buttigieg went to bat for this doctor a number of times on the legal front?
Well, I think it's very unfeeling. I mean, I don't know how anybody could not be seriously disturbed by a doctor who would do this sort of thing. And in fact, he had lost his medical license a few years before he passed away for a number of professional shortcomings. So I think his comments are just reflect some of the extremism that you now see on the far left side of things. They're even opposed, many of them, to protecting a baby who survives an abortion, and won't support legislation that would protect the life of that child after it's been born.
Sir, you mentioned having greater oversight of abortion providers. There have been a number of states that have run into problems on appeal when they pass laws such as requiring abortion providers to have admitting privileges at hospitals, or abortion clinics being required to have hallways wide enough to get a hospital gurney through, for example. Yet, as much as pro-life leaning states try this, they keep running into legal hurdles. Why do you think things that simple end up getting struck down?
Well, again, it's although the pro-abortion folks talk about wanting to do it for the good of the woman, or they're concerned about the women's health, whenever it seems like whenever legislation is put forward that would help preserve and protect the health of the woman, they're opposed to that. And of course, we have a case now in the U.S. Supreme Court that'll be argued March 4th that involves a law such as you mentioned. The state of Louisiana passed a law that requires abortion doctors to have admitting privileges at a hospital within 30 miles of where the abortions are performed. And that was upheld by the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals and has now gone to the U.S. Supreme Court. So the state of Louisiana passed that law to help protect women, so that if something happened that was very serious during the abortion, that they could be immediately admitted to a hospital by a doctor who would know their situation. It's an interesting case because it was not brought by a woman who wants an abortion. It was brought by the abortion providers. And so a major question in the case before the U.S. Supreme Court is whether they have any right to bring that case, because they have a conflict of interest. On the one hand, Louisiana is trying to protect the life and health of a woman, and the abortion providers are trying to evade that regulation and have it declared unconstitutional. So I do think that law will be upheld, either because the Supreme Court will find the abortion providers have no right to bring the case in the first place, or because the court will find it's not a substantial obstacle to have an abortion and that it's a reasonable regulation. So I think we're making some progress in the U.S. Supreme Court. I think if we have one more constitutional originalist appointed to the Supreme Court to replace one of the liberals, that we may, in fact, have the opportunity to see Roe versus Wade overturned.
We're talking with former Nebraska Attorney General Don Stenberg. And, sir, you mentioned just a moment ago that this issue is getting more extreme in the minds of many on the left, including lawmakers, including those running for office. And I just wanted to get your thoughts on how it's changed or hasn't changed in the past generation, because on the one hand, you have states literally defending abortion up to the moment of birth, and in some cases, even after the child survives an attempted abortion, you have folks refusing to require doctors to care for that child that is now fully outside the mother. Then again, back in the 90s, you were fighting to protect babies who were halfway outside of their mothers. So are things more extreme now, or does it seem fairly similar?
Well, I think they are more extreme in one sense. The abortion providers are have always been opposed to virtually any regulation of abortion, and so that continues to be the same as it was. But when Nebraska passed its ban on partial birth abortions in the mid-1990s, there was only one dissenting vote. And Nebraska is a pro-life state, but there were pro-abortion members of the legislature, who generally support abortion, but even they wouldn't oppose a ban on the partial birth abortion. If we did the same thing today, I'm not sure that would be the case. Back in those days, I never would have thought that a law that would require a survivor of an abortion to be taken care of and have his or her life preserved, that would be controversial. But today it is.
When we have the debate about very late-term abortions now, certainly third trimester, and as we just discussed, some of the states allowing it right up to the moment of birth, the argument for not banning abortions that late is usually, well, they only happen when something has gone horribly wrong with the presidency. The mother is somehow, her health is compromised, or they found out that their baby has very little chance of surviving or has an extreme deformity. Partial birth abortion obviously happens at the very end of the pregnancy as well. From your experience, what were the reasons for seeking those? Was there a medical crisis? Were there issues with the baby, or were they often simply a matter of convenience?
Well, the Guttmacher Institute, and they tend to be on the pro-abortion side, but they did a study, and I can't lay my hands on it at this second, but what they found was that most late-term abortions were not done because of health problems for the mother, or that the mother's life was in danger, but rather because the baby was unwanted and the woman had delayed in making a decision to have an abortion, and so on and so forth. So my thought is, if the Guttmacher Institute found that most abortions, very late-term abortions, are not done to protect the life or health of the mother, that we can be pretty sure that that's accurate coming from a pro-abortion organization.
And Mr. Stenberg, as you probably know, the Republican-controlled U.S. Senate is about to have votes on a couple of issues. One is to require medical care for babies who survive attempted abortions, and the other is for a ban on abortions after 20 weeks of pregnancy, because it's quite clear that unborn children can feel pain at that point, if not earlier than that. Neither will get, most likely, to 60 votes in the Senate, which is the procedural hurdle to get to a final vote. What does it say that legislation like those pieces of legislation can't get approved in Washington?
Well, I think that it's the extremism on the pro-abortion side of things, and to not be concerned that a child at 20 weeks or beyond feels pain when its life is taken. It seems very callous to me. But I was just looking through the position of the Democratic presidential candidates on this issue, and I think every single one of them is opposed to prohibiting abortion of a child when it's old enough, developed in the womb, to feel pain. So I just think that's very callous, and I don't think that's where a majority of the public is. I think that pro-abortion folks on these extreme things, like allowing an abortion survivor to die or be killed as a small baby, or even the pain-capable issue, I think a majority of Americans would like to see some restrictions. In fact, I saw a poll recently where 70% of the Americans that were polled supported some reasonable restrictions on abortion. So I really think that the extremists on the Democratic side, particularly office holders who have that view, are simply not reflecting the views of the general public.
Well, Republicans in Washington are generally focused on those two issues. As you well know, other states around the country have gotten more aggressive from a pro-life perspective. A number of states have passed the heartbeat bill, which means it's illegal to terminate a pregnancy once a heartbeat is detected in the unborn child. Alabama went even farther than that, banning all abortions unless the life of the mother is at risk. What's the smarter position here? Is it to go more for the strongest possible pro-life position, or is it to try and claim, at least for the moment, the political high ground of where the Washington Republicans are, and show the public that the Democrats are the ones out of step?
Well, I think you can do both. I don't think it has to be either or. I think obviously the strongest argument is for saving the lives of little babies that survive abortions. It's hard to understand how anybody can be against that, although we know that they are. But I think some of the laws you mentioned, for example, the fetal heartbeat bill, those bills, if they are adopted or have been adopted, could lay the groundwork for a U.S. Supreme Court case that could potentially overturn Roe versus Wade, because that's the only way they could be upheld. And, I think my opinion right now is that a majority, that we have 5 members of the U.S. Supreme Court who think Roe versus Wade was constitutionally incorrect. But I think we're probably going to need one more justice who believes that on the U.S. Supreme Court before they're going to be willing to move. And the timing on that could work very well if President Trump can make one more appointment and the laws that you just mentioned work their way through the court process over the next 3 or 4 years. One of those laws could be the basis for the Supreme Court to review and overturn Roe versus Wade.
Mr. Stenberg, just a couple of minutes left in our conversation here, and I want to get folks a picture of what it's like to be at the epicenter of one of these huge fights over abortion. Obviously, very intense passions on both sides of the issue, and in the 90s and early parts of the 2000s, you were right there, ground zero at the Supreme Court when this was all being debated over partial birth abortions. Explain how you became a leading figure in this and what it's like to be in the middle of it.
Well, I was the Attorney General of the state of Nebraska, and so when Nebraska passed its ban on partial birth abortions, I was the lead defendant. An abortion provider, Dr. Carhart, sued me and others. And so we defended that lawsuit, defended Nebraska's ban on partial birth abortion, and we lost at the district court level, appealed that to the Court of Appeals, lost there, then went to the U.S. Supreme Court, where unfortunately, in a 5-4 decision, the court in that case basically said it's a constitutional right to perform partial birth abortion, which was a horrible decision. But then Justice Alito was appointed to replace Justice O'Connor, and then when the federal ban on partial birth abortions was considered by the court with Justice Alito there, they upheld that ban on a 5-4 decision. And I think the lesson to be learned there is the critical importance of the views of the people on the Supreme Court of the United States.
How did the pro-choice side treat you during those days?
Well, pretty much the way they do any pro-life person. We had dueling news conferences on the steps of the Supreme Court of the United States. The then head of Planned Parenthood nationally was expressing her views, and it's just hard to believe. I continue to just not understand how people can support, having a baby partially born, partially outside of the mother's body, and then killing a baby that could go on to live a useful life. I just don't see how anybody can support that, but they do.
Finally, Mr. Stenberg, I know you have a new book out. Tell our listeners what they're likely to find and the message that you really want people to hear.
Yes, the name of the book is Eavesdropping on Lucifer. And we all know that our culture has changed dramatically over the last 40 or 50 years, including, abortion, religious freedom, and so forth. And Eavesdropping on Lucifer offers an easy-to-understand explanation of how this happened and hope for the future. It's similar to C.S. Lewis's book on it's called Screwtape Letters, and it's been endorsed by a former Attorney General of the United States, John Ashcroft, who said Eavesdropping on Lucifer is common sense, digestible wisdom that can be easily understood by every generation. And it's available for pre-order on Amazon.com and BarnesandNoble.com, and we have more information about the book on EavesdroppingOnLucifer.com.
EavesdroppingOnLucifer.com. Well, Mr. Stenberg, a lot to look forward to here in the next couple of weeks. Like I mentioned, the Senate votes on those two key issues, and as you mentioned, oral arguments at the Supreme Court on that critical case out of Louisiana. So we'll all be paying attention, and hopefully sometime soon we'll be able to have you on again, and we look forward to that. Thank you very much for your time today.
Yeah, you bet. Thank you.
Former Nebraska Attorney General Don Stenberg, I'm Greg Columbus, reporting for Radio America.